AM 700 KBYR and Oldies 102.1.
Oh, yeah. Welcome back. The Michael Duke Show. Your home for Common Sense Radio. Appreciate you coming in and being part of the program. Tom Harris is the executive director of the International Climate Science Coalition. He speaks about climate change and the science behind it and what's good and what's bad. We had him on here recently to talk about the good that President Trump was pulling out of the Paris Climate Accords and what the positives were on that. And we're having him on today, though, to take a little umbrage with some of the things that the president is doing with his own energy policy. We'll find the good and the bad in that as we bring on Tom Harris. Good morning, sir. How are you?
Oh, pretty good, Michael. How are you?
Not too bad, sir. Thanks for coming back and joining us. All right, so let's talk a little bit about, again, the good, the bad, and the ugly. We were praising President Trump for pulling out of the Paris Climate Accords. That made sense for all the reasons that we outlined in that show. That was a good discussion. And he's still got some other good things that he's been taking apart. I mean, his new EPA director has basically pulled 30 different programs apart that were basically not really science guided and were really impeding American progress as far as economic progress and everything else. His Clean Power Plan was a good thing to pull the plug on, but he's got some other flaws in here. What do you see as being problematic inside of Trump's current energy plan?
Well, the main thing is they're still considering carbon dioxide as a toxin, as a pollutant. It's really quite strange. It's like they're trying to please both sides at the same time in the argument, but it doesn't really work. I mean, mostly his energy policies are really quite beautiful. I mean, they've ended the Obama administration war on coal. They've approved the Keystone XL pipeline to help flow of crude oil from our Western Canadian Sedimentary Basin to your refineries, and those sorts of things are really great. But the trouble is, at the same time, he said 2 weeks ago, as part of the Energy Week, he said, concerning the Paris Agreement, he said, maybe we'll get back into it someday, but it will be on better, fairer terms. We'll see. Well, the bottom line is, if the Paris Agreement doesn't make any sense, because, we're not the master controller of climate, we should focus on clean air and clean water, but the idea that we control climate change, I mean, Trump himself has said that doesn't make any sense. So why would you want to get back into the agreement, even if it was on fairer terms? The whole point of it is wrong. And unfortunately, his energy secretary, Secretary Rick Perry, while he's said a lot of good things too, he then turns around after saying that carbon dioxide is not the primary control knob for climate. Those are his words. He then says that we need more nuclear power to reduce carbon dioxide, and we have to have a sequestration of carbon dioxide underground. Well, it doesn't make any sense. Why would you say something was not a threat and then boost programs to reduce it?
Right. Well, and that's exactly it. It seems like we're getting mixed signals, mixed messages, as it were, out of what's coming out of this on Washington. And it's like they've got one side of this of the script was written by folks who are making sense, and one side is more tried and true. Hey, let's just pick pieces and parts out of some of these old speeches and throw them up there. That's just what it seems like. It seems like it's got a bit of tone deafness attached to it.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, and the trouble is it leaves the door wide open for a future president to get right back into Paris agreements. Because as long as you let the public continue to think that carbon dioxide is a toxin that, we just have to get a fairer treaty or we have to have more nuclear power, people are still going to want to have these kinds of controls on carbon dioxide. And yet CO2 is actually benign. I mean, they pump CO2 into greenhouses up to 4 times the level in the atmosphere around, and we don't see any increase in warming in the greenhouse due to CO2. There is an increase in warming, of course, because the hard roof of the greenhouse it doesn't allow hot air to escape, but that's entirely different. We don't see that, but what we do see is the crops grow much faster. So, carbon dioxide is clearly plant food. So if we really want to get out of these kinds of Paris agreements permanently, we have to explain that the underlying premise of it is simply wrong.
Well, and we kind of analyzed a lot of the things that were going on with Paris some of the problems that were to begin with. I mean, then they make assumptions that the Paris is just the jumping off point, and that even if everything in the Paris framework was instituted, that it would account for less than 0.02% of a degree in 30 years. 0.02%. I mean, it's insane.
And the price tag is incredible.
Right. And again, that all makes the assumption, the entire framework of the Paris Accord makes the assumption that that is only step one. That then step two,
in fact,
I mean, that this is just the base foundation, and again, a base foundation that costs hundreds of billions of dollars a year. One estimate, and I can't remember the guy's name. He was a climate scientist who did a thing for Prager University. He was talking about, in the end, as it gets close to the end of the ramp up at the end of 30 years, it approaches nearly $1 trillion a year in cost. $1 trillion a year.
Bjorn Lomborg with the Copenhagen Center.
Yeah, that's what it was. Bjorn Lomborg, that's right.
And he says $1 to $2 trillion per year to the end of the century. So his numbers are actually much higher. And now he's saying a good $100 trillion for something like a third of a degree change, if indeed the UN science was right. And of course, they say that Paris is only the first small step on a long journey to stop climate change. And that's where the environmentalists, the hardcore environmentalists like David Suzuki, they are right. If, in fact, we were the controllers of climate, then Paris would just be a first small step. So, indeed, if you're going to go down that route and accept that CO2 has to be stuffed underground, or we need more nuclear because of CO2, or we need a fairer Paris agreement, then you've got to go the whole way. There's no point in just having Paris. You're going to have hundreds of Parises. And so that's where we really have to kill this. It's a meme in society where most people think that carbon dioxide is a pollutant. They have to get up there very clearly. And, Pruitt has just announced, the administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency, he's just announced that they're going to have he calls it public, just get it right here. He's actually having a review of the science, okay? That's what he's doing. He's bringing in scientists on both sides of the debate, and they're going to have a proper review. And that's, of course, what's needed, because what's going to come out of that is, first of all scientists will agree carbon dioxide is not a pollutant, okay? But what will come out of that is that the scientific opinion is all across the board, not just on the degree to which we might be causing warming, but even whether warming or cooling is going to happen. Where I sit here in Ottawa, 21,000 years ago, there was 2 kilometers of ice over our head. There was probably 4 kilometers over your head, because in the middle of the northern part of the Arctic, there was 4 kilometers of ice. And that is coming back, okay? That is coming back, and that is real. Civilization destroying climate change, not 0.6 degree change in the last century like they're talking about, they're saying that we supposedly caused. Nature is going to roll over us with ice ages, and they will come back. I mean, whether it comes in 1,000 years or 5,000, nobody knows. But that is real climate change. That's brutal, relentless climate change.
Right, because it's cyclic, right? I mean, climate is cyclic in nature. It's not a set,
that's right.
Hey, it's like the thermostat. We set it and forget it. That's the way it's always going to be. It is cyclic in and of itself, whether we have human intervention or not.
Yeah, and we probably have some impact, and we should definitely reduce pollution and save energy. I mean, those are sensible approaches. But the whole idea that we're going to spend trillions of dollars to stop warming that currently isn't occurring, when the biggest threat is to get ready for the eventual ice age. And when that eventually happens, no one knows, but we will need our strongest forms of power, things like coal, oil, natural gas, hydro, nuclear. Wind and solar won't cut it when an ice age hits. We're going to need our best sources of power. And yet the government, until Obama got out of power, the government has been pushing these flimsy power sources to supposedly stop what is probably a trivial change that we're causing in comparison with nature. So the whole thing's backwards, and that's why, with the exception of the CO2 business, Trump's energy plan is a breath of fresh air, and let's hope that he can pull it off.
Well, and I would hope so. But again, the problem becomes mixed messages. What's going on,
Well, that's right. I mean, the public is less confused. You know, if CO2 was this great threat, then why is Trump boosting coal? Like, huh? Doesn't make sense. So what they've got to simply say is, first of all, the science of climate change is all over the board, but CO2 is not a threat. It's plant food. And so, of course, we're going to have more coal with proper pollution control devices, that sort of thing. And that's where the mixed messages is just makes you want to pull your hair out.
Right, right. Well, let's talk a little bit. You just mentioned it, so let's talk a little bit more about that. You know, this idea that you know, wind and solar, all these green energies are going to fix it for us. Now, there was a report that came out from Environmental Progress. Now, Environmental Progress is a pro-nuclear group. You know, they don't make any bones about it. They're a pro-nuclear group, but they made a very interesting assertion that basically came out and said that these green energy, specifically they were talking about solar, create more waste both in the construction of and the end of life cycle discarding of solar panels, something like 200 or 300 times the waste that nuclear power creates. They're talking about in the sludge that's created during the manufacturing process. They're talking about all the heavy metals and how do you deconstruct these defunct solar panels and everything else. So that really that people need to stop talking about how it's the end all and be all, because the science is not there yet to back that up.
Yeah, that's right. Solar is still an evolving technology. I mean, it may get better, but you know, wind power is a mature technology, and it still is really insignificant. In fact, the funniest thing, Michael, is that, you know, China is a massive exporter of wind turbines, so they love the climate scare. And of course, they're not going to reduce their emissions. It's pretty obvious. But you know what power source they use to actually make the wind turbines? They use coal. Okay, so you get a wind turbine, you might as well put it at the bottom, made with coal. I mean, you're really not going to save emissions in many cases. In fact, Professor Howard Hayden did a really interesting analysis. He showed that if you have a region of the United States that is powered by coal and you bring in a lot of wind power, you cannot turn off the coal stations because, of course, there are times when there's not enough wind, or there's times when there's too much wind and you have to feather the turbines. So you have to keep the coal stations on idle all the time. Okay, even the times when they're not needed. And these are, you know, they produce more pollution when they're on idle. It's kind of like if you drove your car down the road and you went 5 miles an hour, 25, 2, 52. Your gas mileage would be horrible. Okay?
Right.
And so if you're going to have these stations on idle and then, you know, bringing them back to full power when there's no wind, the net result that Professor Hayden calculated was you would have more pollution than if you just left the coal.
Wow. Well, and let's talk for a second about the boogeyman in the room for a lot of environmentalists. The boogeyman in the room is nuclear power. Now, France has been basically generating a huge portion of their national power. Somewhere at one point, it was something like 85% of all their power in France was being generated by nuclear power. And I know, again, it's the boogeyman, you know, 3 Mile Island, Fukushima, Chernobyl. We hear about all these things. But the bottom line is that it generates more power over the long haul with a smaller footprint. And in the long run, more power for less waste, as we just pointed out, than a lot of these green energies. And it is sustainable. Yeah. And while it's rolling, it's cleaner than anything else available, right?
Oh, yes, definitely. And, you know, there is high-level waste, and we do have to handle that properly. But you have to keep it in perspective. I mean, if you as an individual, an average North American, got all of your electricity in your whole life from nuclear, the size of the high-level radioactive waste that would be produced is the size of a golf ball in your whole life, okay? So, I mean, from that point of view, we can handle a golf ball-sized level of high-level radioactive waste. And, you know, the other thing is people don't realize that when it's high-level waste, okay, when it's quite radioactive, it decays very quickly. You know, environmentalists always say, oh, you have to hold it for millions of years. Well, that's not true. You can hold a used CANDU reactor bundle in your hands totally safely after only 4 centuries. Okay, now 4 centuries when it comes to geologic storage is a blink of an eye. Because if you're putting that waste in a geologic formation that has been stable for millions of years, another 4 centuries, yeah, that's very, very safe, especially if you put it a mile underground, which is, of course, what they've been talking about. So when the environmentalists say, "Oh, the nuclear waste, it's dangerous for millions of years," well, they're talking about low-level waste, things like gloves. Okay, it's very low-level waste. It's not very dangerous in the first place, and yeah, it takes millions of years to decay. But so what? But the high-level waste, 4 centuries, you can hold a used CANDU reactor bundle in your hands. So you're right. The whole nuclear thing has been blown out of proportion.
Yet the heavy metals and everything else, and again the heavy metals and other things that are in some of these solar panels and some of these other things, they'll be there pretty much forever and leaching into the ground.
Oh,
I mean, all these kind of stuff. And again, not that they won't find a way to deal with these things, but stop telling us that it's the end all be all right now. The technology still has to develop to be able to deal with this stuff. And like you said, even if we find a way to handle all the waste, it's the sustainability of the energy level that they can produce. On a sunny day, produces great energy. On a cloudy day, not so much. On a high wind day, you got to shut it down. On a low wind day, you got to supplement it. On a day that it's just right, okay, great. You get so again, there's a balancing act here, and the thing is, in my mind, is that they continue to take this thing, the biggest thing, which is nuclear, off the table. They're forcing us now more into this coal, which is a bigger polluter than nuclear and all these other kinds of things. So, I mean, we're stymied at every level.
That's right. In fact, if you look at the Sierra Club's list of what they want to get rid of, they want to get rid of coal, nuclear, oil, natural gas, new hydro stations. You just go down the list. You're left with almost nothing. You know, one stat is very important for people to know. They talk about 3 Mile Island and things like that. You know, nobody died. In fact, the containment worked. While there was a leak within the reactor, the containment system worked. And in fact, in the whole history of North American nuclear stations, the number of people who have been killed as a result of nuclear power, and I'm not counting falling off a scaffolding or getting hit by a truck on the property, the total number of people killed is 0. There's been nobody killed by nuclear power. In Chernobyl, of course, in Russia, they had a horrible design and, you know, very inept operators, and a lot of people died. But the funny thing is, Michael, as a result of that Chernobyl accident, the Russians kept running that kind of reactor, and we suddenly had a moratorium on nuclear reactors, even though the problems that happened there couldn't happen here. Because we have water as a moderator. They had graphite, and it was a graphite fire. So it's not even physically possible to have a Chernobyl-type reactor event occur at, these kinds of reactors that we have, for example, in Canada. And yet we suffered. Our reactor building stopped as a result of Chernobyl, but the Russians kept operating it.
Yeah, it doesn't make any sense. And the thing is, Tom, we're talking with Tom Harris from the International Coalition on Climate Science International. Look, Tom, the bottom line is that we've got to address it. Unless we're willing to go back to 1850, right? Unless we're willing to go back to a time when we weren't using power for pretty much everything, we've got to find a way to provide this power without in as small a footprint as possible, as far as pollution and danger and everything else. But if we're going to take off some of the biggest contributors off the table, we're never going to be able to get there.
Well, right, and we have to focus on the right things. I mean, President Trump released something called an America First Energy Plan shortly after he became president back in January, and it said here, President Trump will refocus the Environmental Protection Agency on its essential mission of protecting our air and water. And, of course, that's exactly right. That's what environmentalists should want. To be spending right now over $1 billion a day on the hypothetical idea that we control the climate and having the EPA so focused on that is crazy. So Trump is an environmentalist. Clearly he is, but he's a sensible one.
Right. Tom Harris, who's been our guest, you can find his writings and more at the International Climate Science Coalition website, climatescienceinternational.org. Tom, thanks so much for coming in and talking with us today. It was good to speak with you.
Okay, thanks, Michael.
Appreciate you being part of the program. The Michael Duke Show continues. We got more coming up. One final segment with your phone calls dead ahead.